When Grumpy Met Sunshine by Charlotte Stein. Mabel knew that working with the grumpiest man of all time was going to be tough. She just didn't appreciate how tough until he stalked into the meeting room, an hour late, with a face like thunder, and a complete unwillingness to say so much as a word. No, hello, no sorry. Not even a response when Greg Pemberton introduced them. This is Mabel Williker, the absolutely first-rate writer we've selected for you now, Greg said, and didn't get so much as a grunt as an answer. The grumpiest man to ever live, or Alfie Harding, as he was more commonly known to much of the British public, simply shoved himself deep into the nearest chair, then proceeded to glare at everything so hard she couldn't understand why it didn't all immediately burst into flames. The fairy cakes she'd baked and rather optimistically brought along should have been a melted mess. The glossy oval table between them, little more than ash. And when he bothered to look in their direction, good Lord, she actually felt the heat peeling off her skin. By the time he looked away, she was sure that she was little more than a skeleton, only without the benefit of being nothing but bones. Because, at least then, she wouldn't have been able to blush. But blush she did. Her pale face was the color of a Kellock bottle. She knew it was, because she could see it reflected back at her in the polished surface of the table, and any second now, he was going to look back and notice it. Her blazing cheeks, like a sign that said, I am never in a million years going to be able to do this. Even though she absolutely knew she could. She was a good writer, damn it, and great at getting things out of people. You just have to find that way in. That little whatever it is that someone loves and responds to. She'd said to Greg when Greg had suggested that she might not be up to the task. Then she'd seen it on Greg's face. That hint of belief, mixed in with the initial doubt from when her agent had gotten in touch with him about this project. So it was infuriating that her cheeks were betraying her. And now Alfie was looking back and he could see it. And this weird expression just broke all over his face. Like anger. Only of a slightly different variety that she wasn't quite familiar with. Which made sense when she really thought about it. Because Alfie Harding was so furious all the time he had probably unearthed layers of the emotion that nobody else had ever even heard of. He practically had a PhD in being really annoyed. This was just his latest find. Baffled contempt. Or maybe amazed disgust. She couldn't tell for sure. And before she was able to decipher it, Greg stepped in. Now I know we've had some missteps. And that you're very wary of working with a particular type of person, he started. And honestly, in any other circumstance, Mabel would have felt relieved. She would have thought that this was definitely the way to go. Do a bit of schmoozing, get them to come around to your point of view. But with a man like Alfie Harding. No, Mabel thought. Abort, abort. And when Alfie suddenly snapped to attention, she knew. She was right. Then braced herself for the coming storm. The 10-inch deep frown between his black ass-pitch eyebrows. That jaw suddenly clenched so tight you could see every muscle through his stark as og and wear sky skin. And finally, that voice, that somewhere just past Manchester voice, familiar to her not only from his numerous surly TV appearances, and that time he'd tried his hand at an acting career, but from her own home. From the places she'd grown up, from all the pubs and parks teeming with a million men like him, because she'd wanted to believe he might be different. But of course he wasn't at all. What do you mean by that exactly? Are you trying to say something about me? He barked out, and of course, Mabel knew why. Blokes like that always hated being thought of as scared. They never wanted to be wimps in anybody's eyes, and certainly not in the eyes of some shiny editor, or some blushing fool of a writer. It was obvious, and so much so that Greg clearly knew it now too. Mabel glanced at him and saw the ripple of realization and discomfort cross his usually never anything but calm, pristine, Patrick Bateman-looking face, before he managed to rein it in and smoothly change course. Oh no, not about you, he said. I was simply commenting on the process itself. It can be so difficult. And then he gave a little laugh, threaded his fingers together in that way that seemed to say, if we were shaking hands right now, you would absolutely love it. But unfortunately for them both, Alfie wasn't having it. He folded his arms across his chest, like a barricade between him and the two chancers in front of him. Didn't seem like that's what you were saying, he said. Oh, well, then let me apologize. Yeah, but for what though? He tilted his head when he asked the question. Like a cat, Mabel thought. Playing with a mouse. Even though Greg was the least mouse-like person she'd ever known, he could silence whole meetings with a look. Almost the whole of Farchester Publishing quaked in his wake. His suits cost more than she paid a month in rent. His license plate declared to the world that he was a boss, with an 8 where the O was supposed to go. Yet to her astonishment, for a second, he did actually look cowed. He seemed to be sweating slightly, and his eyes kept darting to the expensive water someone had laid out on the table. Like his mouth had gone dry. And if he could just wet it a little, he could come up with a good explanation for what he meant. Even though it should have been easy. Just tell him he's a big, strong boy and we'll move on, she thought at him. But he simply couldn't seem to do it. And now Alfie was starting to look amused. Smug, almost it seemed to her. In a way that was just as familiar as his accent and his anger and his overblown macho pride. Give it a second, and he'd be sneering at her the way he was sneering at Greg, like every boy she'd ever known from high school, or played with in caravan parks on the East Coast, or been insulted by on the number 36 to Ripon. At which point, she knew. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a chance for him to poke fun at people like her. That was why he'd agreed to this, finally. After years of people trying to nail him down, it wasn't just the charity promise his manager had made, or a chance to prove he was more than a lunkhead, as she'd seen hinted at in various gossip corners of the internet. After that overblown reaction to the supposedly disastrous foreword he'd written to one of his teammates' books, oh no, he'd probably spotted Greg's massive car and his silly license plate, or seen the lineup of writers they'd gotten to audition for him like this. As if he were a Broadway show and they were desperate teenagers who'd just gotten off the bus from Idaho, and he must have thought he'd hit the having a good laugh jackpot. When Greg had finally scraped her out of the bottom of the barrel, Mabel Williker, ghostwriter to such luminaries as some nobody on EastEnders and that bloke from Bake, Offhood cried so much on his cake. He had turned it salty. It was a contemptuous arsehole's dream come true. He barely had to do anything to make her look foolish. Then, he could just flounce off. In a huff, he could pass off as righteous. And even though it sank her heart to think it, she could tell she had it right. She felt it before he leveled those inky eyes on her, as he answered for Greg. Or maybe I should give it a guess. You think? I'm a big hairy manimal who's never gonna be able to work? Well, with this here human cupcake, he said. Then, just for good measure, he flung a finger in her general direction. As if nobody were going to know that he meant the woman in the pale pink dress with the cherry-covered cardigan to match, or understand that this was almost definitely a jab about her weight. On top of the rest of this mess, so really, was it a surprise that she snapped? Probably, considering she was well known for being the sunniest person on earth. But the thing was even sunny, people had their limits. And apparently, being thought of as a gross joke by a disgruntled ex-footballer was one of them. You know what? Actually, now I think about it, Greg, I'm pretty sure this was a mistake, she said. Shakily, it seemed to her. But by God, the words were fully formed. Act. Those were whole and polished sentences that had come out of her. Act. And they sounded almost annoyed, too. So annoyed, in fact, that she had the satisfaction of seeing his smile drop. About a second before she swept right out of the room. Sweetheart, I know you think that went terribly, but honestly, I don't think it sounds that bad at all. Greg seems to think he was a lot nicer to you than all 17 of the others. I'm sure as soon as we can manage to get a hold of Alfie, we can sort all this out. Apparently, he doesn't have email. But Greg has assured me he does have a phone, it's just only turned on sometimes. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I think Greg said, but it was hard to be sure. He sounded extremely busy. I'll let you know as soon as we hear something. Emmy X. Emmeline Sanders. Leafland Literary Agency, Inc. 220 Madison Avenue, Suite 406. New York, NY 10016. leaflandliterary.com. At Emmeline Sanders. Forward to James Dolan's memoir. It had to be me. What isn't there to say about James that hasn't already been said? He's a top bloke, never leaves you hanging, no glory hogging or any of that. No messing you around. Not to get too mushy or anything, but I'd, shake his hand. Anyway, enough about me. Get on with reading this book.